Thank you, and thank you for the warm welcome, Anna. So my name is Rachel Gibbs. I'm just trying to make sure this technology works. Maybe a second. There we are, that's better. So my background to how come I came to be here today is I started my career working in taxation. It's given me a good finance background and it's technical side of HR, and I did a master's. I've specialised in compensation and benefits pretty much throughout my career once I left taxation behind, and I've worked across share plans but also benefits, tax effective benefits, and then later compensation. So I have a broad brush across the whole area. My career has predominantly been in commercial organisations, and if I slip and talk about businesses when I mean organisations such as your own, then forgive me, it's bad habits on my part. So the plan is to talk about distributed teams, and some of you have already alluded to the distribution that you're working with. Then I'll talk about compensation, take a break after compensation, and then talk about benefits. And I put together a list of resources that you can find on the web. And I was thinking about it, why I could find them so easily. It's around the wording that you use to find them. But I've put together what I can. If you think of other things you'd like me to look for as well and add, more than happy, pop that in the chat, and I'll include that after the session. And then if we have time, we'll go on to a case study. But as I say, questions after compensation and after the free resources. The free resources very quick. So in terms of distributed teams, I wanted to start by talking about employees and what is an employee as opposed to a non-employee, because this makes a difference to how the tax and other elements come into it, and also how it makes a difference in terms of the exposure you as the organisation have to the authorities in the country where you're based and operating. And you'll be quite familiar with office-based employees and hybrid, which is kind of gaining traction in this post-pandemic world that we're in. It will also include your occasional benched labour, where you pull on people that you need to help you for small pieces of work, and they go through the payroll. I've talked here about remote and local international, and I think for me, local international is where you have an employee in country A, you transplant them across into country B, and they go on to local terms. It's completely local to country B, and there's no involvement back with country A. With the post-pandemic world, we're seeing a growth in remote, which can be the employee takes themselves and relocates to country B, but also people are also country hopping and just moving wherever their backpack and laptop takes them, probably not paying any tax in any country at all. Whether you have people like that, I don't know, but for this purpose, they're like a local wherever they're based. Interns and volunteers are also employees as far as the authorities are considering. And then we have the international expat packages, the traditional cash-rich, very expensive international package. And then you have Local Plus, which is like your local employee, but you're also adding in extras to cover, say, schooling and other direct costs, which come with them being relocated, but they're on local contracts. I've mentioned here non-employees, and the reason I really wanted to highlight this is because they come with a significant risk depending on how you use them. So for instance, freelancers, contractors, consultants, they're very often providing a contract for service. So they're coming in, they're supporting you on an ad hoc or maybe a regular basis, but they may well be employees. And to give you an example of what I mean by this is, if I come to your offices and support you with a compensation project that you need support with, I'll provide consultancy. But then if you ask me to stay on and help you manage the monthly payroll, the relationship starts to change and the regularity of my involvement with your organization changes, and I may make the switch from non-employee, a freelancer, a contractor, to an employee. And the other way you sometimes see it is when people leave. Sometimes they're put onto a freelance contract to sort of ease them out into retirement. And this is the type of disguised permanent employment that many authorities are looking for, and it creates a risk for you as an organisation. And we'll come on to that. Agency workers are not employees, but because they're kind of picked up through the agency as an employee, that the risk is less. It's really those top three, freelancers, contractors, and consultants, that you need to be aware of. And then here I'm trying to look at the risks that you have got. And the first of these is the creation of a permanent establishment. So if you have an employee in country B and they're there long enough, they're resident and they're working out of there, and you have headed paper with the location of country B, other factors, the country authorities within that country will start to question whether you really are creating a permanent establishment. And the challenge becomes around registering in the country, going through the relevant authorities to gain permission as a non-profit organisation, and how, you know, the extra burden of administration and reporting that brings. You potentially also have to consider that you would have to pay tax, social security, and other relevant insurances in that country if the employee is there on a consistent basis. And you may have employment law issues that they, I mean, the example is that you go to make the role redundant, and then they cherry pick the best of the employment laws. So they take country B for certain bits and country A for other bits, and that's not ideal for you. There's potentially visa and immigration issues to consider. And then there's data protection legislation, where the data is held, where the data is being used and manipulated, and what data they're working on. And the final one here is transfer pricing and value added taxes. I'm not an expert on this. It just to raise a question mark in your mind with it. If you're recharging back from country B to the original country A, and there's an enhancement, there may be transfer pricing issues to consider, and or value added taxes. I mentioned earlier around disguised permanent employment, and this is really where your risk is. Are they really employees in country B? And the final point is something that I'm not an expert in. This is more your area of speciality, is whether there are expectations, cultural perceptions, donor expectations, which if this risk and this challenge becomes public, what are the consequences for you as an organisation? I don't know. I just know it's a potential risk. So then, in terms of mitigation, what can you do about it? The first is a use of what's known as a PEO, a professional employer organisation, or a co-employment. There are a number of these around, and it's quite there's quite a lot of providers. I did some research for you. And two big names I understand in the NGO field. One is mauve, as in the colour mauve, and the other is, I've completely forgotten. I'll pop it in the notes later. Global Partners, I think, and they're both concentrating on doing a large number of NGOs. They are very expensive, and the cheapest I've come across is $350 a month. The most expensive I've seen is $600 a month. But what they do is they provide for the employee in country B, they provide the payrolling. They give you, they tell you monthly how much your invoice will be and where to pay, and they deal with the employment law issues, so that they would support you in that redundancy issue and through a country B contract, it would ensure that you could deal with any redundancy issues, for example, that you might have to. As I say, the downside is they are expensive. The other downside is that the market's quite bloated. There are a large number of these providers out there. They at some point there'll be some rationalization, and they're also using quite a number of them are using third-party payroll providers, which may or may not be comfortable for you. But to give you an example, a lot of them use ADP. ADP has a number of setups in many countries, but it also in turn has third-party providers for some less common countries that it operates in. So the relationship and possibly the risks of data fallout and information fallout through that process is something that you would need to check. As I say, that they are a possible mitigation, but they are expensive. The next mitigation is specialist legal advice, and this is expensive, but it does one way of dealing with it. And the third one is recognise and accept the risk, and this is what many organisations do, many businesses. They know what their risks are, and they think that they'll just take the chance. I would say for an NGO, based on my experience of doing payroll audits tend to, the revenue authorities tend to go to the big organisations first, and smaller big businesses, then the smaller businesses, and I'm sure that they would look at NGOs, but it may not be top of their list in terms of processing for payroll audits, but it's nevertheless a risk for you. So I was going to turn next to compensation and take an overview of how salaries are set. I've split it, the donut. I've created a donut here, and the middle of the donut is looking at internal aspects, and then the outside of the donut is looking at external aspects. And then the idea is that all of these elements come together, and they give you they almost come to an individual salary that you're dealing with, but without kind of having an awareness of all these elements, it becomes a bit more messy. And next we'll talk about salary setting specifically, how best practice works. But I just wanted to kind of pull all these elements together and say, to come up with a number, there's a lot of elements to it. And the first is, I'll start with the middle of the donut, and that is around the employee. What skills and experience they bring, what previous experience that they've got, what they can offer you, and also how good they are at negotiating. I mean, I think that's another key factor. And then the job really is around the size of it, the seniority, the complexity, the scope, and you know, you're obviously going to pay more for a leadership role versus a administrative role. And so, you know, that administrative role has a different scope, a different level of complexity versus the leadership role, which is possibly managing people as well as looking externally from the organisation and presenting the organisation outside. Internal aspects would be your existing pay levels. So you, again, going back to the administrator and the leadership role, you would normally always expect the leadership role to be paid more. The external factors are around the sector that you operate in, the unions and work councils pressure that you may or may not be under, the regulation. And here I was thinking of in Belgium, for instance, the requirements are that you have a statutory annual increase that you have to put through depending on the sector that you're based in, and you don't have any negotiation power around that. Also in the UK, for instance, there is a minimum wage and you shouldn't go below that. So those are the regulations. And then cultural aspects, and I know from working in Hong Kong that university graduates are paid significantly less than European graduates, although by the time they reach leadership level, they've all caught up. But the starting salaries are quite different. And those are kind of the internal pressures that you have, but then also in a wider scope, you have other elements. And the first of those here is I've called it compensation philosophy. I don't want to over egg it. I just want to encourage you to have a clear view of what you want, what messages you want to use your compensation payments to achieve. And what I mean here is it's not all about high pay, for instance. You can have, I worked in a number of very low margin businesses, and they didn't pay well, but they were still able to attract employees. They did it through a number of ways, one of which was that they brought you in a little bit low, a little bit higher than you were in your previous job. So they gave you a stretch, and they offered you career progression that much more quickly because you wouldn't get that normally. The other organization offered you these challenging, dynamic, ways in which you could improve the business. What they didn't tell you was how change resistant the organization was, and how quickly you would get burnt out trying to make these changes that you were told you could do. It's a bit cynical, but my point is that pay isn't the be all and end all. We'll talk about that later, but it is about what you as an organisation want your pay to do for you. And another example from my experience was Arthur Andersen. They paid at the top 10% of employers for accountants, but the up or out philosophy, and if you didn't progress quickly within your career, you really had to move on. But the question is, what happened to Arthur Andersen probably reflects the very aggressive nature of the compensation philosophy, which was one of the elements permeating the business. The next is around data and how good your data is, how able you are to monitor your levels internally and externally, the information that you hold to really drive that salary setting. The macroeconomics, we can't escape, and where we are at the moment with possibly going into a global recession is a key factor in that. Your budgets, how much you can afford, and finally your ability to attract and retain people. And if you can attract people easily, if you've got a high profile and lots of people are coming to you wanting to work for you, you possibly don't need to pay as much. Turning now to salary setting. Now, this is best practice, and I think it's fair to say it's lengthy, and I think it's quite expensive and quite administratively burdensome. So we start with your compensation philosophy, which is what are you trying to do with your salary payments, and the messages you're using through that. The starting point, however, for the process is your job description. What does your job actually entail? And I just want to mention, it's not about people at this stage. It's really about the job. So you start with your job description, and then you evaluate it. And this is a process of, it's more or less a mathematical process. You have your description, going back to that leadership role with management responsibilities, that would give it a bigger size compared with the administrator with no management responsibilities. The role of the leaders looking to promote the organisation externally, again, would give this a higher factor, the complexity. So this all kind of comes together in the evaluation process, and very often you end up with a graded role, which is classified and sized. It is a very robust process, and then using that classification, you then can look at the external market data and compare apples with apples. That is the idea. Most jobs are easy to match. Some won't be. If you have a very hybrid role, like you have a finance manager and a finance/HR manager hybrid role, some of those are less easy to match. But you might take a pragmatic view based on the two roles to sit together. If they're very close in terms of external market data, out by $2,000, for instance, you might say, okay, we'll take the average of those two. if they're out by a significant margin, then you have different discussions for a hybrid role. Obviously, then you need to look at your internal comparisons, how this role fits in terms of your internal structure and your internal other roles internally. And then you have an individualized salary, and then from that you could possibly build salary ranges. At this stage, when you're looking at all this data, there is nothing about a human in here at all. It's really about the job and what the job is worth in the external marketplace and internal comparisons. And that's how the best practice for salary setting works. As I say, it's lengthy, and I think it's quite expensive. It's not something that generally you can pick off the shelf, but that's how it works. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about fair pay, because I know this is something that's important to many of you. And this is a typical organisation chart. And as you can see, I've put the 3 blocks in blue. And the idea is that those 3 people are doing the same job. And the point I wanted to make here was they may come with different skills and experience. Over time, however, because they're doing a broadly similar role, those elements, and as they settle into the job, those elements should disappear, and you should be aiming to pay them very similarly. The challenge comes across when they're overseas, they're in different countries. And here, your market data is useful for that. If you don't have market data, that's where it becomes more challenging, and you could look to increase by cost of living. You could look to use other elements that we'll talk about under the resourcing, the free resourcing. But this is really the point, is trying to make sure that wherever possible, you are achieving equality across those roles, so those 3 blue roles there. Another factor that I know is of interest is around CEO ratios. There is some data available. One way of dealing with it is to look at the CEO salary and benchmark it using the process we looked at just a second ago. And another is using I found some very old data on the internet, and this is all UK data, unfortunately, and it's based on turnover ratios. So the amount of money that the NGOs, the charities in this case, are able to attract. And Amnesty is got a turnover ratio of 0.82. In fact, they've all got turnover ratios of less than 1% for their CEO. British Red Cross of less than 0.1%, and Oxfam of 0.31%. These CEO ratios, they're an indicator of based on turnover rather than average employee to executive director. There isn't much data otherwise on this. The only we have in the UK, there is a employee-owned organisation, John Lewis. They own the Waitrose supermarkets, and they aim to ensure that their chairman, their CEO equivalent, is paid no more than 75 times the average pay of non-management staff. And this helps them support their own compensation philosophy, but also manage the internal ratios that they have. I wanted to turn now to transparency scales, because I know this is important for some of you. And it's a scale, but it's not a clear scale. There are other elements of it. And normally you start, or normally, you would start at the very lowest level, which is that you as an employee, you're told what you're earning and you're given an increase, and that's it. And I've come across organisations that expressly forbid you from discussing it, and you would be your contract would be terminated if they learned that you discussed your salary internally. And then gradually the process starts with market data that we talked about, and job levels, and then gradually these become more and more less opaque, more transparent, until you get to a point where at level 5, for instance, the notice board has full salary ranges, full job grades, and you as the employee know exactly which grade you're in. You have the ability to discuss it with your line manager. Your line manager understands it, and then you can see what you need to do to get to the next level, the next salary level, the next job level, and it's all completely transparent. The advantage of this process is it treats employees like adults, and the position 1 is a very parental, this is what you get, you're not to discuss it. It's a very child-parent relationship, whereas transparency moves you across that spectrum to more adult. I mentioned under 5, team discussions on bonus distributions. I've come across this once. It's a very transparent way of dividing up the pot. It's very lengthy, but it's quite successful, but not many organisations do it. And then final slide on this section around compensation. This is around developments. There's a lot of movement and change within compensation. Gender pay gap reporting has been around for a little while, and increasingly more and more countries are adopting it. Switzerland took it on this year. In the US, there's a move to advertising jobs with salary ranges. California adopted it this month, Colorado, Connecticut have it, New York follows soon. What I've seen with this is I saw a role advertised in California with a starting range at $75,000 US, ending at $180,000. That's a huge range, 100% range. And I know as an employee exactly where I'd like to be on that range. And I suspect the company is very clear about where it wants to be. So there's going to be a lot of unhappy employees across that spectrum, or candidates really. So it's until they get more familiar with this process and a bit more sensible, perhaps, this will take a while. But there's some useful information in there. In the post-pandemic world, particularly, and with remote working, there's a move towards global pay and location agnostic pay. This is, for me, so what the way this works is that HR manager, for instance, they're going to pay $75,000. That's fantastic if I'm based in a low-cost country. If I'm based in a very high-cost country like Switzerland, it's not so good. And if they bring everybody up to a Swiss salary level, for instance, I don't know how as a business you can manage that. It's very expensive. And also, is it fair? If I'm doing the same job based in Switzerland and I'm earning a Swiss salary, the person in, say, Romania, who's on a significantly lower cost of living, has got the same salary as me, but they're getting a lot more for that in terms of their take-home pay, effectively. The other element under global pay and location is that companies are offering a minimum, and this seems quite a fair way. So if they have a set salary, and if you're in a low-cost country, you're at that set salary. If you're a high-cost country, you're paid above that to reflect it. The next point is around salary self-selection. Not many companies do it, but they are trying to move towards it. The problem comes, of course, is when you've got people who are not very confident about their skills and experience. They may self-select at quite a low level. Someone who's more confident and maybe less competent may self-select at a higher level, and that could create some tension. And then the final point is around transparency. I think we're seeing a move towards greater transparency. And as we discussed earlier, there is quite a broad range of elements that you can use towards transparency. So I'm going to take a break now, have a drink of water. Anna, or do we have any questions? Or I see Joel nodding his head. I think that means he's okay.
Yeah, feel free to put them in chat if you prefer your questions, or just kind of verbalize them as you wish. I think there is some intense thinking and information digestion is happening. Well, you can also follow up on one-to-one eventually with Rachel once you.
And I know that Anna received some feedback before the and Natalia before the sessions started, so I tried to incorporate that as we've gone through. There's one question, is there?
Yeah, Joel's saying that the music in the
okay, thanks, Joel.
Yeah, well, yeah, but Joel supplied us with actually a very nice and long list of questions. Joel's questions were mostly about data from which we can extract information about salary ranges and yeah, for particular countries, and also how to adjust salary to the cost of living. I mean, Rachel mentioned that she will provide us with some tips and some resources or outsourcing companies request, but actually the question which refers to what we have been discussing right now is the one: how do organizations manage salary adjustments based on the country's cost of living, also linked to internal and external equity, and is there an index which can be used, and what sort of limitations are there with these indices, and do you have any thoughts on how to overcome them? If maybe Rachel could cover a bit of that. Rachel mentioned just a moment ago that indeed the same salary can mean very different things in different countries, because it's true, it really differs a lot. And actually Julia was asking pretty much or commenting or saying something the same, because we collected some questions in advance, that people's expectations can be very different depending on the country they are based in, paid leave, working hours, but that perhaps also relates to the benefits matters, and also need for stability and cost of living. I broadly understand how much is the rent, food, energy, and what types of services and safety nets they have access to publicly.
It's a great question, and my experience has been that most employers don't factor in those individual costs. So let's take a finance manager, for instance, and say the market says that salary is worth $50,000 US, and that's what you might aim to pay. You might pay 50,000, you might pay 45, depending on what you can afford. And after that, the costs that they incur are a personal expense. However, in the current climate we're in, with high inflation and interest rate increases and other elements, energy cost, some companies are giving people a one-off payment. Other companies are doing more in-house things, so they're providing free food for people, supporting with other costs that people have, such as transport. But generally, they try and separate the salary and what, you know, the payment for the service from the other ongoing costs, and they use an annual or biannual element of annual reviews to increase those. But they don't tend to provide individual support for cost of living. And to put this in context, if you have a remote worker and they choose to live in a high tax country, if they're completely remote and they're choosing where they live and they're doing their taxes correctly, you as an employer wouldn't seek to reimburse them for the extra taxes that they're paying by choosing to live in Germany versus Switzerland, for instance. Those elements of a personal cost, and really for people to take for themselves. I hope that answers the question. I thought I'll look at benefits now, which you touched on.
If I move on, could I just have 2 comments on that, just because it was my question?
Hi, Julia.
So one, in reference to the last thing you mentioned about the location, I think if someone is relocating, I can see how that's more easy to do, right? Because it's like if you were living in Italy and you're moving to Denmark, then that's a different, there's a very different situation for you. And if you're doing that after you've been hired, I can see more the argument of like, you may perhaps say like, well, that is like your option, depending also on like, you know, what is the capacity for the organization to adapt to that situation. I don't know, like I could see more that argument of like, it's your choice, although debatable depending on the circumstances of the person. But like if they're just country hopping because of, you know, they want to, like that's a very different situation. But we even have these differences, for example, among the people that like, you know, when they were hired. So, you know, then it's like, if you have someone hired in Switzerland and you have someone hired, I don't know, like in Spain, or you have someone hired in the US, like they're completely different tax situations. And, you know, you sort of like knew going in. So I feel like the organization should adapt to that. And I think even to the move, I think it would depend on the circumstances of the move. If you're just sort of like living the digital nomad life and you're just hopping around, I can see how that's your personal cost, and like, you know, you see that. But you know, life is more complicated than that. And the other thing was on the like services that people have access to, just because I think there's a blind spot here potentially, and we have it, I'd say, where we think of differences that are somewhat similar. And it's just a matter of degree, but like we have people in places in the global south, and even within the people that are there, it's completely different if you're like in a big city where you may have like just like pavement, drinking water, a hospital near you, you know, like really basic things that other people don't have. And that would mean that, you know, if they had to get medical treatment, they need to travel. If they need to, like, you know, they have a lot more things going around. So our question on that point was more on the, if you just apply an index that is like a cost of living. So like if you're in this country, apply, you know, multiply this by times 0.75, let's say. And if you're in this other country, you multiply by 1.3. I feel like that would create also a lot of, you know, inequality, because effectively, I mean, obviously the organization cannot cover for everything.
Yeah.
But maybe that like you adjust less for a country that has a technically a lower cost of living, but where like also the circumstances people are living in may be worse, and you may be able to pay a bit more to, you know, try to cover a bit of that. I don't know. Like this is sort of like where my thinking was when I wrote the question, but just to highlight that we're talking about like huge differences, not just like, you know, somewhere where like like I feel like if you compare like Switzerland to Germany, if you just, or like the Netherlands, if you just adjust with an index, you're probably fine. But there's a lot of other situations where you probably aren't.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And I once had we had a guy who went to work in Niger, and it took a week to travel to visit him because of the road situation and the distance. He was actually paid a basic UK salary, so he had a lot of spending money because the goods and services that he needed in Niger were much cheaper. He didn't have access to Western goods, so that element, that expense wasn't there. And you're right, yeah, he would have had to have been evacuated out using a specialist service in the event he needed hospital treatment. And it's unfortunate because you end up with this situation where Westerners going into remote locations get better treatment than local people, and that's a huge inequality, and it's not fair. In terms of you as an organisation, how you treat your employees, which is what we're concentrating on, that worked really well for the company that sent him to Niger. In terms of cost of living, one of the free resources is a cost of living index, which will help with some of that. I think it comes down to negotiation and what you as an organisation feel is fair. And if we take the Niger example, you know, do you think it's fair to send him out on a UK salary, knowing that he'll have a lot of ability to save money? I think in this instance, we took care of all the taxes, so he didn't have a tax issue in Niger, but he had a lot of disposable income. It's a difficult situation. Sorry, Julia.
Sent to Niger from the UK company, or was he a Nigerian hired in Niger by a UK company, which would be sort of like more close to like a situation?
He wasn't on a local, he was on a local plant. No, he was on an expat package, but on a very lean expat package, pretty much just his salary and this emergency support if they needed to evacuate quickly.
Yeah, because like what we were thinking about was more in the, you know, if we say, like, if we pay like, let's say a Swiss salary to someone that is based like in Colombia, like that is also, you know, a huge difference even within the organization, because then there's someone that is living on a lean budget for where they're living and someone that has massive disposable cash. But at the same time, you know, like they may have to pay a lot more to cover for those expenses. So anyway, it's just an internal debate that we're having. I was just wondering what your thoughts were.
Yeah, it's not an easy question to answer because there are so many factors. I think for me, I've always used the market data as a sort of starting point. What would we pay this person we're sending to Niger? What would we pay him locally? And then what do we need to factor in that he will struggle with as a result of the placement? That was kind of how we dealt with it in this particular instance. He loved being that remote. I don't know I could do it, but he was very happy with it.
Yeah.
Can I just add something as well? With like, I think because partially what I used to do before was work for Greenpeace, and we had a regional office. So then we had 4 different markets all within one structure trying to be aligned. And one of the things I noticed was you can use market data, but some markets don't value campaigning or don't value advocacy. So the whole market is down, and it's sort of, therefore, even if you use the market data, it's kind of reinforcing a relatively negative trend in that country, rather than recognizing that NGO work or charitable work should be better recognized. And so in those places, I felt like we should lift above the market if campaigning is just not valued.
And you and I talked about this with reference to Japan, didn't we? And I think for me, the market data is the data that can't be changed. But in terms of how you approach it, or Greenpeace approached it, then that the more you pay generally, the more access you have to better, more interested people normally, and so. But I suppose the question that's going in my head, Carmen, is whether you are attracting the right people as a result of paying more, and also whether you as an individual organisation or Greenpeace could really change the dynamics in that marketplace. And great that you want to try, but is that the right use of donations? I don't know. I'm being a little bit provocative, but I suppose I'm feeling a bit defensive. I'm not feeling defensive. I feel I should defend the data, and that's what the data says. But what you choose to do as an organisation is really important, and that goes back to that philosophy about what you want to do, and that really is overarching it. Do you think that's fair, Carmen?
Yeah, to be clear, Greenpeace actually uses the market data and sticks with it. Now I'm not at Greenpeace, but I still really think, like, I hear you on why the data should be like that, and you can't really change the society on that sort of point. But one of the shocks for me in shifting from work in like New Zealand, Australia, Europe, etc., is how little value is placed on advocacy as a career. It's not seen as a job you do. And so there's already like other issues that people have to take those sort of roles, because they have to convince their parents that they're not doing something that's disastrous by taking that kind of job, where it's really hard to explain just how many layers of barrier there are in some countries compared to others. And so then when like the market already says these jobs get paid less, that's because society values them less. Yeah. But what we're trying to do a lot of the time is capacity building to make it more possible to have that kind of advocacy so it can be successful, so it can be valued. But if you don't start that cycle somewhere by actually valuing the people you want to work for you above how society values them, it's really hard to get a kind of positive cycle going, and you just end up with a whole lot of non-recruited positions. And that's what I see a lot of with a lot of organizations. They have an open recruitment for a year because they can't find someone to do it, because the the benchmark says the salary for a position in an NGO role is far lower than a kind of the equivalent role, and people don't come because they have a kind of great passion, because that's not really established as a standard way of like thinking about your work. So yeah, I get why the benchmarking is the most consistent with data, but I also think it's reinforcing something that we're trying to change. So we have to think a little bit about how to change. Like it's one thing to have a capacity building program, but if you're playing that program into exactly the structure that's stopping that capacity building being effective, then it's hard to get out of that cycle, I think.
And if you were to advertise the role, so suppose the market data says it's worth $50,000 US, and you advertise it at 60, would that attract a lot more people and give you more choice as a result? I mean, that's one way, is you can go to the market and make it very clear how much you're paying.
Yeah, I think it's also partially about, like, quite often we are partially advertising, but we're also looking for the people that we think are going to be really effective, and then going to find them and then finding out what they're prepared to do it for. Okay. And that there may just be a gap, I think, sometimes between, especially like that gap probably exists all over the place. But in those countries, I think that gap is probably like worth looking at, because you have to get good people in, or you will just have an empty position for a long time. Yeah,
no, it's an interesting point, and many factors. Going back to that original slide with the donuts, there is, I didn't pick that one up particularly, but there are so many elements to it.
Yeah. So to just maybe to add a comment from Joelle, who says that it will come down to how well we discuss these topics. So perhaps it's also like discussing within the team and making sure everybody is heard and respected and feel good about their own situation. But we can also come back to this point once we talk about compensations as well, benefits as well, because that's also part of it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Actually, Joelle raised hand again. Oh, yeah.
I think I can get the music still. I'm just taking myself on mute again. But yeah, we're going through the process right now of discussing compensation benefits, not only within the leadership team, but across the organisation, which contains 20 people. So really what I think it is going to boil down to for us is, yes, we start with the data when we start looking where we think we sit in terms of salary within that data, but then we open it up in dialogue and we see so many different perspectives coming from the table. And I think that is our starting point. And using those conversations which happen across the organisation as a basis for making future decisions on whatever our compensation benefits framework will be, I think it's going to be crucial for us. So I guess you probably describe us as, I don't know, viciously transparent, that number 5 that you've got on the slide here.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think transparency is becoming increasingly more important. And yeah, thankfully those days of companies at level 1 have changed. If there's no further points, I'll move on to benefits.
Yes, please.
Okay. So I haven't come across much global consistency, except possibly around paid holidays and paid public holidays. I've put a list of standard European benefits here, which would include life assurance, support through arrangements such as employee assistance programs, pension contributions are very normal, medical provisions, sick pay, and parental leave. But mentioning pension contributions reminds me that I did some work in the Czech Republic, and the cost of social security there is 35% of salary, and that provides for a very substantial state pension when you come to retire. So most organisations aren't offering a pension contribution alongside this, and this is the challenge with benefits is they vary so much by country. There's no real standard as I've identified, and they're also very expensive. I think it's fair to say most of these are not cheap. And then looking at best practice around global benefits, my experience has been that you would seek to determine your global benefit offering. And here's an example, it's not necessarily the right one, but you would match the local average day's vacation. And what I mean here is, in the UK, the minimum vacation is 20 days per year, plus public holidays. However, the average is 25 days per year plus the public holidays. And so you might say we'll match to 25 days in this instance. You might also say we'll go higher, we'll go to 27 days, knowing that most people notice the number of holidays that you're offering through your benefit package, and that would be attractive to them. You might also say we'll provide parental leave. If it's not provided, we'll give employees 1 month off outside of maternity arrangements in the event of a new arrival. Or you might say we're going to provide a standard maternity package of 6 months paid, or if it's higher, you obviously get the higher statutory local arrangement, but we'll ensure that you get a minimum. And you might also say we'll give you 2 times life assurance, and that would be your global benefits package. The advantage of offering that is it provides a consistency, and it goes back to that philosophy. I don't like the term because it feels so grand, but it gives you an overall awareness of what you can offer, and it provides consistency across the regions in countries in which you operate. You have to recognise there will be local differences. Medical cover in the US is one of the most expensive, and that will add additional fixed costs. Benefits, I think, are really expensive, which nicely brings me on to my next slide around low cost benefits that you could think about offering if you don't already. I know some of you will do some of these already. Paid sabbatical after several years of service. I've come across one organisation that did this. It was an investment management house, and what they did was after 5 years service, you would get 1 month sabbatical. It would be paid, and you'd get it in addition to your annual vacation that year. The reason it was effective was because it gave you something to look forward to. It gave you something to plan towards. It was used top to bottom, so even the senior directors on the board used it, and the people in the lowest levels, which included catering staff in this organisation. So it was used top to bottom. And because you knew your time would come, you were more willing to support and be collegiate to make it work. Very effective and very popular. Another one is unlimited holidays. I wouldn't use them alongside sabbaticals. I think it's one or the other. Unlimited holidays work particularly well where you have long hours, or you have spikes in work. So you've got a particular annual deadline that you need to concentrate on. And it pushes you towards a more adult to adult relationship, which is the employee comes and says, I'd like to take this amount of vacation off, and you agree on the workload between you and how to deliver the work alongside that paid holiday. The other advantage of it is that this carry forward cost that you might bear stops. So at the end of the year, whatever people haven't taken, as long as they've taken a minimum requirement in accordance with statutory legislation, is lost. So there's no carry forward or accrual of holidays. Another one which is nice to have is a birthday day off. These are all around holidays. And this might be if your birthday falls on a working weekday, you get the day off. You may or may not decide to replicate that if your birthday falls at a weekend. Flexible hours, this provides people with some flexibility to manage their lifestyle around their working responsibilities. Support with travel costs and travel loans, very popular and often low cost. Educational assistance is very popular. I did some research on the differences between East and West cultures, and there is Confucian means that people are more equity-based and more considerate of fairness in China, for instance. And for them, company socials, family days, summer barbecues, sport days are really more important than they are in Western environments. But they're still popular, and you may well get tax relief for those expenses as well. Shortened hours for a month. There were a lot around holidays. I say, again, going back to these spikes of work, I worked for a company that they serviced boilers for hot water and central heating. And this time of the year, the work's beginning to ramp up as people put their heating on for the winter. But in the summer, particularly in August, there was hardly any demand for that. And so they had shortened hours for a month. It was a really popular benefit. I think they, out of the August month, they worked 1 or 5 days, and the rest of the days were for them to take. And when you've got children, for instance, that works very nicely. Very popular benefit. And then one from my old starting point in my career around low cost tax effective benefits, such as cycle to work, where people, these are UK ones, but you take out a loan for a bicycle, you get it tax free, the loan and the bicycle, but you repay the loan to the company. And electric vehicles, cars are another popular benefit, locally based. I just wanted to wrap up now before I talk about the free resourcing, and just to put some context around compensation. So I'm passionate about it. It's what I do, but I think it's important to put it in some context, as I say. And these are Hertzberg's two-factor theory of motivation. There are others out there. This is just one that for me reminds me of the importance of compensation, which is to say it's a satisfier. And if you get it right, people will be satisfied. The more you pay them, they won't be any more satisfied, they'll just be paid more. If you get it wrong, obviously they are dissatisfied, and they'll generally tell you in one way, or through behaviour or directly. And these are important to get right. But the things that really motivate people are on the right-hand side. Passion, which in your sector is such a driver. Achievement, recognition, responsibility. These are the motivators, and I think once you've got your compensation and benefits right, you've got it right, and you almost, it's a bit like tinkering with an engine. You don't need to keep going back to it. These motivators on the right hand side are the key ones, which will really make the difference to what you're trying to achieve. And I just wanted to put that into some sort of context. And then, as promised, some resources. I believe Anna will share the slides with you afterwards, so they'll be in the slides. I've found a tax overview via KPMG. This is the link to the central place. I think they cover pretty much every country in the world, and in quite a lot of detail. It might be in some instances too much detail. There's also the Mercer Cost of Living Index, which I know we've talked about cost of living. That will give some interesting information. One person in the questions asked about salary increases, and I found a free resource for global salary increase projections for 2022. I wanted to talk about the local salary surveys. So this is a tricky one because it varies by country. And I was lucky enough to come across a number of recently for UK-based charities. There's a Charity Job, TPP, ACEVO, Harris Hill. They provide free salary surveys. There's also global agencies, and I would just, such as Robert Walters and Page Executive and Michael Page, I would treat those with a little bit of wariness, both on the charity, on the agency supporting charity, and also with the global agencies. They get paid by commission, so they're interested in pushing salaries up, and so they tend to be a bit higher than necessarily the market. So if you use these as resources, use that knowledge. Just to treat it with a little bit of maybe skepticism's too strong, but just with an open mind. There's also Glassdoor, pay scale comparability, comparably. We know that US states are opening up the offer information, so that will be another important source. There's living wage and median wage information from the ILO and other organisations, OECD, for instance. Trades unions and works councils are another important source of information. And there's your personal network. You may have people within your network who can support you with information on non-competing NGOs, for instance, what they're doing in their marketplace. So I'll make sure you get this, but there's a couple of ideas for information that's available to you. Okay, any more questions? Where should we go? Oh, do you? Carmen says you have unlimited holiday and it works really well and creates a very adult. Yeah, I think it does. It really makes a difference. Okay. Okay, so Julia, thanks for your comment about Spain. Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
Any more questions that we haven't covered?
Yeah, there are some questions which Joella posted earlier. They're mostly concerning resources, like, for example, are there good health insurance options? The deal offers good options focused on each country, and Safety Wing offers a good global options. So if maybe there are some resources on that, and also there is questions from Joel. Is there a good website out there that lists the role categories, characteristics for each role, and the salary range for each role? And maybe this is also covered by among one of those resources which Rachel mentioned.
It should be, yes. You should. The only problem, as I mentioned earlier, is if you have hybrid roles, it doesn't give you that level of detail, but it certainly will do a normal finance structure from a input clerk, maybe, to a finance director and such like.
Yeah. And then also among those payroll companies, Rachel talked about it in the very beginning of presentation. It's true that there are really lots of them. They're really mushrooming right now. Some can be more costly, some are cheaper, and kind of maybe Rachel's perspective, is it worth using them, or kind of it's okay to deal without them, or does it make life easier, or on the contrary? I mean, just your personal perspective as HR expert.
Yeah, so they take away that risk of the country the person being resident, that it creates a permanent establishment for you, and they make sure that they get the payroll right. So it's all above board. It's all correct. That's the advantage. I saw a deal, and I think I saw somebody mention they were paying $600 a month, which there's enough. I've come across other organisations paying less, so that doesn't seem such a great deal, pun intended. The information I've got is that Mauve and I've forgotten the name, International Partners or something like that. They are concentrating on the NGO sector, or not concentrating. They have a high profile within NGO sector. I don't know if they're any good. This is the problem. And as I say, there are lots of questions to find out about the information flow within them, because they're using third-party providers who may in turn be using third-party providers to do the payroll. I would also have questions about the level of support they're able to offer you. So, for example, in the UK, you get statutory rights after 2 years. And if you miss, it means you can't terminate an employment very quickly. It becomes very complex after the 2 years is finished. And do they let you know a few months in advance that you're coming up to the 2-year window? Do they provide that level of support? These would be questions I would have if I was using an organisation such as Deal. But the advantage of them is that they are really they've kind of got your back in this sense of operating in multi-countries. It just comes at an enormous cost, and it would be nice if there was a way of sort of consolidating groups and reducing that cost, but I doubt it. I doubt that's possible.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Globalization partners. Thank you, Aggie. Yeah, that was one I was thinking of. Yeah.
Yeah, globalization partners. Yeah, Agnes mentions.
Yeah, so those two, MOVE and globalization partners, are tending to focus on the end, or are being used significantly by NGOs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Joel was also asking a list of the payroll companies, but I guess for NGOs, these two, would be actually the list. And let's say if it's a free choice of the employee to be a freelancer, I mean, what risks can it pose both to the organization and to the person who works? Let's say a person kind of prefers to relocate, not being particularly rooted in a particular country, maybe live, if I don't know, half a year in one country, half a year in the other country. It's a free choice of a person. So what kind of risks or disadvantages can be seen for that situation?
So in terms of the freelancer, the question is really whether it's a disguised permanent employment, and whether the local authorities would say it's disguised permanent employment. If it is, it becomes really complex, because they then look to you, the organisation, to determine whether or not to recover social security costs, taxation, and any other relevant employment costs, and possibly they would fine you. It's not ideal. The challenge is really determining whether someone is a freelancer or an employee, and this goes back to this regularity of work. It goes around the relationship that you have and what they're doing for you, the contract of service. So they just come in and do a specific piece of work, they just provide expertise, and then they go, or contract for services, so they're running your payroll or they're doing your admin. And I know a lot of you are using this, using freelancers because it gives you flexibility. All I would say is it's a risk, and it could get quite messy if it was to be found out. I can't say to you don't do it, because that's not fair, but it's a risk that you need to be aware of and make an informed decision about. And yeah, that's all I can say really, because it is what I can tell you what the consequences of the risk are. But as long as you're aware of it and know what those are, then that is what it is. The other, Anna, you mentioned was about people country hopping, and this is where it gets to be messy and complex. And ideally, they would take care of it all themselves. There are two ways to do it. One is that you have a contractual arrangement, and you say if you country hop, you are totally responsible for your additional costs in this country. You know, if you go to Czech Republic, for instance, and we're going to have to pay more social security as a result of that decision, we would look to recover that from you. Whether you can do that in reality is another issue, but it gives you, the organisation, some protection, and you would do it that way. I've never seen it done because it's so complex and risky, but it's entirely possible. That it would be through policy and contractual agreement. I think if you were to allow that level of flexibility. If you don't allow that level of flexibility, you've still got the risk, unfortunately. But you know, that's just the way it is. And post-pandemic, you know, come 2 years after the height of the pandemic, revenue authorities are starting to look at this, and they are picking it up in audits, and their raison d'etre is to raise as much money as they can for the countries that they're supporting, the exchequers, and so this is an easy win for them. When they'll start with the big companies, the smaller companies, as I said, and then they'll come down to NGOs. So it'll be some time, but I would imagine over time they will start to look at this in some detail.
Yeah, okay, I see. Because we talk a lot with nonprofits, and actually many of them are indeed struggle with the situation when they cannot really project long-term employment. So they're, in a way, they do it not even out of choice, and more the lacking of financial security. Like they can secure someone's salary for the coming, I don't know, 3 months, 6 months, and that's it. So they kind of contract this person for 6 months, and then they see whether they will be able to advance. And it is indeed complex, and nonprofits try to get out of the situation, but it's a constant struggle. Yeah, I imagine it's easier for bigger companies when they're able to plan their budget like for, I don't know, several years forward. For NGOs, it can be different, more complex.
Yeah, no, I understand that, and it is unfortunate that that's the reality, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I also wanted to mention, because we requested some legal advice that was still in the process of getting, but this was a sort of a comment that they raised, at least from the perspective of some European countries, is that even if you're working remotely, then your home becomes sort of the workplace. So it's also the responsibility of the employee, of the employer, to make sure that you have, like, you know, like an ergonomic chair, and that your setup is like okay, and all these things. If the person is hopping, that means that that impairs your ability to do that, most likely. So I think that's also something that may be problematic. You know, often people would look at like whether it affects their taxes, or they're like, if I stay long enough in this country, I'll be a tax resident of X, and then it's not an issue. But actually, you may have other types of issues that are more related with labor law, for example, whether you're providing the type of setup that is required, etc., etc. So yeah, I mean, I would want that the flexible, like, we can hop everywhere would be easier and actually possible. But I think that at the moment we may have some hurdles with, like, you know, labor law being applied sort of in a very strict way and not adapting to the change of the situations, that they're just sort of prolonging the protections and the regulations that you would have in an office to then, like, well, then this applies to the home, and that's it. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It is it is very complex, and I think it gets more and more complex as time progresses, and the more countries you operate in, the more complex it comes. It's not an enviable position at all. It's easy for me to sit here and tell you what it should be, but the reality is it's very difficult.
Yeah, I think Joel has a question. Yeah,
I'm just wondering about the practicalities of an organisation like ours trying to track where its staff members are on the planet. We wouldn't necessarily know if a staff member is working from a different country.
I coughed a bit in the middle of that. I'm sorry, Joel. I missed some of it.
Yeah, we wouldn't necessarily know if one of our staff members is working in a country other than where they reside.
Right. Yeah.
So there's an enforceability thing here.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a huge challenge. And I know one person whose company monitors people through their internet access, where they're logging on from, which then creates problems with GDPR and data protection. It's a bit facile to say it, but it's you're kind of, every which way you turn, you're kind of blocked, and almost there's no defense. Yeah, it's very difficult, and I think all you can do is put those policies in place to protect the organisation, and then just watch as things change. It's quite a moving world at the moment because of all these changes around remote working and people being based in different countries from where their contract is, where they tell their employer they are. Yeah, it's a really tricky situation. Okay, I had a case study. I'll share it with you for completeness. So, and I'll talk you through the answer because we're very short on time. So you have operations in Poland, USA, Singapore. One of your US-based employees asked to work temporarily from Poland. They are Polish, but they're on a US contract, as a family member was critically unwell. However, after 9 months, the passing of the family member has passed, and they're still in Poland, and they've got a relationship beginning there, and but they're supporting the team in the US still. They're earning 85,000 US dollars, while their female colleague doing the equivalent role locally in Poland is earning $55,000. What are your key considerations around the disparity in salaries, your options, and how would you deal with it? I think there's a few things before you even start looking at salaries here. There's the elements we talked about working remotely, about contracts, about expectations for delivery, which they are achieving, but are they eligible to work there? Are they able to stay there that long? And to have a US green card, they have to pay tax in the US, they have to pay tax in Poland because they've been there long enough, social security costs and other, it's really complex. And then you've also got this element of the fact that this guy is earning significantly more in the same country doing the same role as his female equivalent. The only way I think you can deal with this is to have a policy in place which says if you've been in this situation, after a period of time, you have to come onto a local type arrangement. I think that's really the only way you can protect the organisation. Because at the moment you've got enormous risks all around with this type of arrangement. It's less than ideal. Okay. Any further questions?
Yeah, can I ask something? Okay, can you help? I mean, Rachel, with developing of policies? I mean, beyond just advice. Do you do this as your work?
I'm more than happy to. Be delighted to help if that's appropriate.
Okay, thank you. I think Joel has something to say or to ask as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to run it past you, Rachel. As you were describing that case study, one of the things I thought of was, the administration around changing a contract from a US-based contract to a Polish contract, assuming the person could, live and work, reside in. And that's where I think one of the advantages of a global international payroll service could come into play. Yeah. For them, it would almost be seamless.
Absolutely, and it would protect you as the organisation, and you as the organisation would have to pick up this fair pay issue. But yeah, over a period, I don't think. I mean, if you take this situation, and this person went out there temporarily while their family member was unwell, you wouldn't look to start it straight away, but when it's clear that they're staying on longer, then you would, yeah. And these PEOs or employment, they definitely are the most pragmatic way of doing it. It's just a shame they're so expensive, but maybe over time they will get cheaper. But yeah, Joel, you're absolutely right. Yeah.
And if I may ask, there are websites which allow, like a marketplace, which allow for search for freelancers on different topics, like Upwork, for example. And and they provide both options for short-term and for long-term.
I'll give you a list because I looked at it recently of agencies, not agencies, of websites. I think they've got a mixed bag, because you don't always know the quality you're getting. It's a bit of a risk. It's quite a lot of investment of your time to find a freelancer. But yeah, they certainly, and you know, the advantages you're giving employment to people in different locations, that gives you a new dynamic on issues. There's sometimes quality issues, but that's the same with hiring an employee, I guess, as well.
And for example, for accounting, it's not like for some organizations, they don't need like a full-time person for that. Maybe, I don't know, a few days a week would be sufficient. So if organizations go for this kind of options, use these websites, what does it mean for both for the organization and for the freelancer? I mean, are freelancers like employed by Upwork and paid like a salary, or kind of what risks it may include beyond quality, which you mentioned? Or is it an option in principle for nonprofits, or it's not recommended?
Yeah, I don't know. So Upwork, I think, take a percentage. I don't know how they get that percentage, whether you pay Upwork and then Upwork pays the freelancer. I would have thought your risk fairly low, particularly if this is a freelancer who's done a number of contracts for a different organizations. So they clearly are freelancing. If as I say, you want them to come in and support with the payroll, that might make a difference. But if they've got lots of clients that they're doing payroll services for, that would give you some protection. Yeah, and in terms of how you pay them, I'm not completely clear. I know that there's one I'm registered with, and it goes through the company I'm registered with, and I get a smaller percentage of the agreed fee. And I think it's a percentage rather than an amount, but yeah, they vary. You would need to do your research depending on who you used. They're different ones. Upwork, I think, is a lot of creatives. There's other ones focusing on a sort of a corporate type roles, administrators, finance, HR.
Yeah, there are different ones. There are even legal support, because sometimes you don't know whether you need like a permanent person to be there, or sometimes you just hire this person for an assignment or for temporary position.
Yeah.
Okay.
Good.
Yeah.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed sharing my knowledge with you and your interaction. It's been a very interactive session, and it's been a pleasure. So thank you.
Thanks a lot, Rachel. For us, it was also a pleasure. I mean, Joel also has to say something. Yes, please, Joel.
Yeah, I just wanted to put my hand up so I could avoid just the clapping goodbye. I really, really thought the session was excellent, Rachel. Just
Thank you.
nice and detailed, very well structured. I'm walking out of this a very happy person. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel. You've made my day too. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. No, we're very happy also to have Rachel with us in principle, because it's a very hot topic, which is in big demand, and we keep on listening, hearing this. So we're very happy. Thanks a lot, Rachel, for sharing your precious knowledge with us. And also organizations, please, if you have more particular questions related to your particular situations, feel free to get back to Rachel and book a call to clarify your questions. And on this happy note, thank you once again, and let's continue our collaboration.
Thanks.
Thanks to everyone as well for the questions.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.